As a young boy, I learned that life wasn't always fair. But I also learned something just as important. Waiting for life to become fair wasn't much of a strategy. If I wanted something, I was going to have to do something about it. I didn't know then, but my first business would teach me lessons that stayed with me for the rest of my career. Chapter 3: My Early Working Career. Opportunity begins with initiative. Don't wait until you have everything you need. Start with what you have and find a way. Have confidence in yourself. Selling light bulbs before having the inventory. When presented with the economic challenges that continue today for many families, I didn't play the victim, but rather I went out to do something about it. My response to this first roadblock was to start my own business, employ myself. When I was 11 years old, I answered a newspaper advertisement looking for students to sell light bulbs in their communities. It seemed like the perfect opportunity until I discovered that I first had to send the company money to purchase the inventory. My parents simply didn't have the money to help me get started. That could have been the end of my first business venture before it even began. Instead, I asked myself a question that would become familiar throughout my life. Is there another way? Here's a Krampus signpost. Don't wait for the perfect circumstances to begin. Start with what you have. Now back to the story. Yes, there was another way. I went around the neighborhood with a notepad in hand, carrying the company's fancy brochures, and I actually got people to sign up for the light bulbs and pay me in advance. When I had the orders, I gathered up the money, created a money order, and sent it off to the company. Several weeks later, I received all of the light bulbs I needed and faithfully went back to each customer to provide them with the light bulbs that they had paid for in advance many weeks before. Without realizing it, at 11 years old, I had solved my first business financial problem. Building customer relationships. What I learned at this young age is that if I wanted to make that first sale or encourage repeat sales, I had to spend time chatting with the customers. After all, I was asking them to pay for the light bulbs before receiving them. To do this, I needed to build their trust in me, to feel comfortable that I would actually deliver their products. I did this for 2 years, sometimes going back to customers who previously purchased these light bulbs and getting them to reorder. The business was quite profitable, and by the time I was 12, I had made enough money to buy some of my own clothes. More importantly, I was learning a lesson that would become increasingly valuable throughout my career. That is, people do business with people they trust. Now here's another Krampus signpost. Build trust before you expect opportunity. Landing my first job at only 13. After selling light bulbs for 2 years, I was looking for bigger employment opportunities again. I answered an ad in a local newspaper. This time, the ad was looking for bellhops to work at the Selden Hotel in downtown Owen Sound. To my surprise, I was invited to an interview at only 13 years old, and I was offered the job. I worked that job for nearly 2 years, carrying customers' bags to their room during the day and bringing them coffee and tea upon request during the evening. As I found when selling light bulbs, building relationships with hotel guests paid dividends. I learned that a few kind words when carrying bags or delivering coffee to guests after hours often resulted in a much bigger tip. I worked this job largely after school and on weekends, but again, I was looking for something more profitable during the summer months. Many of my friends had already concluded that there was no point in looking around Owen Sound. There aren't any summer jobs in this town, as my friends would tell me. They weren't entirely wrong. Opportunities for students in our small town were scarce. However, one hotel extended stay guest gave me a huge tip, not in dollars, but in an opportunity. When I mentioned that I was looking for something bigger for the summer, she told me about a friend of hers who owned a gas station with a motel and restaurant attached. She even offered to take me to meet her friend since it was located 25 miles from my hometown. Once again, a relationship had opened a door that I didn't even know existed. Now let's take a minute to reflect on what's been happening in this chapter. Looking back today, I don't remember how many boxes of light bulbs I sold. I don't remember how much money I earned. What I do remember is discovering that almost every obstacle has a solution, if you're willing to think differently. I also discovered something that became one of the foundations of my career. Trust is earned, one conversation at a time. Whether you're selling light bulbs, leading sailors, or managing a college, people need to believe in you before they'll follow you. That's the lesson that has never changed. Now it's time for my personal letter to my granddaughter. Dear Marlise, when I was 11, I didn't have money to start a business. At 13, I didn't have experience when I applied for my first real job. A little later, I couldn't find the summer work I wanted in my hometown. At each stage, it would have been easy to wait for a better circumstance. I learned instead to start with what I had. But I also learned something equally as important. Opportunities often come through people. My neighbors trusted me enough to pay for light bulbs they hadn't received. Hotel guests trusted a 13-year-old boy with their belongings. And one of those guests eventually offered to introduce me to someone who would change the direction of my young life. So don't wait until everything is perfect before you begin. Start with what you have. Do your best with it, and earn the trust of people you meet along the way. You may be surprised where those relationships eventually lead you. With love, Grandpa. Thank you again for sharing this chapter with me. In our next chapter, I'll tell you about another roadblock. This time, there were no summer jobs available in my hometown. What happened next taught me that sometimes the best opportunities aren't found where you're standing. Sometimes you have to look beyond your town limits.